Greetings, friends and citizens of the world. This is Brother Bart with Conspiracy Corner News. I am Bart Sibrel. I thought this story would be of interest to people out here. Let's take a look at it. Maybe enlarge it a little bit. It says, for the past decade, Russia has been working on its Eagle spaceship intended for a lunar mission. The landing of Russian astronauts on the moon is scheduled for 2030, which is more than 60 years after the United States went to the moon. Not only that, it goes on to say that the spacecraft to go to the moon was started, the construction, 10 years ago. So if you add another 10 years to make it 2030, it's taken 20 years for the Soviet Union to develop the technology to go to the moon. Now, this is with the benefit of 50 years of better technology. So 50 years after they went to the moon for the very first time with 1960s technology, which only took 8 years, now with 5 decades, better rockets, better computers, better everything, it takes 2.5 times longer to reach the moon. Do you understand that? It only took 8 years to go to the moon with 1960s technology, before microwave oven, before cell phones, before VCRs, with 1/1,000,000th of computing power in all of NASA that's in a cell phone. It only took 8 years to go to the moon. And now, with 50 years better technology, they're thinking they might possibly go to the moon in 2030, and they started building the technology 10 years ago, which means it's going to take at least 20 years to develop the technology to go to the moon, 50 years after they went to the moon with 1960s technology. Do you understand that? And keep in mind, the Soviet Union has already launched the first satellite. They launched the first animal. They launched the first man. They launched the first woman. They launched the first crew of 3. They performed the first spacewalk. They performed the first of 2 spacecraft simultaneously. I mean, this is pretty remarkable, don't you think? That the country who did all of this is 60 years after the country that claimed to have walked on the moon. That's like saying someone made the first automobile in America, and it took Russia 60 years to build an automobile. I mean, that's hard to imagine because, nowadays, this is a modern automobile, which is about 1,000th the capability of the first automobile. It can go 1,000 times farther. It's 1,000 times more capable. And yet now NASA can only go 1,000th the distance to the moon. The space station is only 250 miles above the Earth. So pick a city 250 miles from you and then flip it, vertical and go up. That's as far as they can go, which is only 1,000th the distance to the moon. Has there ever been a breakthrough? Let's say the first automobile, okay? So 50 years after the first automobile, that this technology is only 1,000th as good as it is in this picture. No, 50 years later, it's 1,000 times better, right? I mean, take a look at the first airplane, right? Okay, so here's the first airplane, and you're telling me that 50 years later, it's only 1,000th as good as this. No. 50 years later, they were building, or close to it, they were building 747s. Can go 1,000 times farther, 1,000 times higher, 1,000 times more technologically advanced. So the moon landing is the only time in the history of the world that the technology that was developed, that 50 years later, it's only 1,000th as capable. That's like saying they built this first, okay? That's like saying they built the 747 first, and today this is our best aircraft. That's what NASA is claiming. They're saying they had this, the equivalent of the ability to go to the moon, and now the technology 50 years later is only this. Because now they can only go 1,000th the distance to the moon. This has never happened in the history of the world. In fact, if you take the first atomic bomb, Here's a picture of it here. It has a 15 kiloton capability, which is the equivalent of about 30,000 pounds of dynamite, right? And now, 50 years later, or even a little bit more than that, the capability is 1,200 kilotons, which is about 1,000 times greater. So, 50 years after the atomic bomb, and this is actually an older bomb, so this is about 50 years after this one. So 50 years after the atomic bomb, they are 1,000 times more capable, right? So if they went to the moon with 1960s technology, they should have been on Mars 10 years later, which never happened. They should be in another solar system by now. But now they can only go 1,000th the distance to the moon. That's like saying 50 years ago, they invented this car, and yet today, this is the best car. It's the exact opposite of logic. And yet, people still believe that the moon landings are real because of their emotional attachment to it. Their team won the Super Bowl 50 years ago, and how dare you say they cheated and lied and bribed the referees to do it and falsified the data. How dare you say that, even if it's true? You see, this is the remarkable thing. And also, never before in the history of the world has a valuable technology been deliberately destroyed. As you probably aware of this clip here, listen to what this guy has to say about what they did with the moon technology. Oops.
Nanosecond. The problem is we don't have the technology to do that anymore. We used to, but we destroyed that technology, and it's a painful process to build it back again.
Okay, so Don Pettit just said, a NASA astronaut, that they deliberately destroyed the technology to go to the moon after it cost $175 billion in today's technology. Now here's a B-52, and this is a pretty remarkable aircraft. There are still about 200 of these in service with the United States Air Force because it works really well. In fact, it's really hard to make anything work better than that because they already own it. They got hundreds of them, and it does such a fantastic job. Did you know that this aircraft was first built 70 years ago? 70 years ago was the first B-52, and they're still around. Why would they spend all this money developing this bomber, and then when they were done, after the first mission, they just throw it all away, throw the blueprints away, throw the data away? They wouldn't do that. So not only is it completely illogical that they could build this, 50 years ago, and today they only have this, right? That proves we didn't go to the moon. Then they're saying they deliberately destroyed the technology. That has never happened in the history of the world before. Not only the technology, the original blueprints, the schematics, everything about that, the videotapes and so forth. In fact, if you look at this story here, here's a story about the original videotapes. The Smithsonian, they've got copies of the Declaration of Independence that are 240 years old. They're protected behind glass, and they're just pieces of paper. You know what I mean? Right? So it says that the lost tapes of the original moon landing, you see, they didn't want them transferred to HD, and instead of being fifth generation, which is what the public saw, to see first generation transferred to HD, because then all the imperfections of the fact that it was shot in a television studio would show up. So they lost them. It says the lost tapes, they started searching in 2006, and NASA says an intensive search of archives and records conclude that the most likely scenario, what happened to the missing tapes, was that they no longer needed them, and so they were erased and reused. Erased and reused. Yeah, I mean, it's, after we signed the Declaration into paper, we could really use that paper, There's such a shortage of paper and videotapes, that you could buy for a dollar or two, remember? And we just bleached off the Declaration, and we needed it to, for some other purpose. That's NASA's excuse. They destroyed the videotapes. They destroyed the technology. according to Don Pettit here. And now Russia, right, with all this extra capability, don't want to tempt anybody here with those ads they force on you here, I guess they figure guys are interested in space travel. But now it's going to take them 2.5 times longer to reach the moon with 5 decades of better technology. It's going to take 60 years. That's like saying they made the first automobile, and it's going to take 60 years for another nation to make that again. Right? I mean, even if this was the first car that they made, right? To say that it would take the Soviet Union, 60 years to be able to duplicate this is a joke. Of course it wouldn't. Might take them 5 years to do it, something like that. But this is the absurdity of saying they went to the moon. That the first country who put the first satellite, the first animal, the first man, the first woman, the first crew, the first spacewalk, all while the U.S. sat on the ground and couldn't do anything, right? That it's now going to take them 2.5 times longer to reach the moon with modern technology than it did for NASA to go to the moon with 1960s technology, right? And people still want to think that the moon landings are real. Brother Bart has this to say: wake up and smell the corruption. Yes, the government is that corrupt. I've talked to professors at universities who say if they saw an Apollo astronaut confess on national TV that the moon missions were fake, they would still think that we went. It's a god to people. And the more it becomes a god, it blinds people from seeing the truth. Look it up. It's in Obadiah. Your pride has blinded you. I don't know what else to say, but that's the update. And of course, Russia probably won't even be able to make it to the moon in 2030, which is 20 years after they first started building the rocket to reach there, with 50 years of better technology than the 1960s, where they made it on the first attempt with 1/millionth the computing power of a cell phone. What can you do? I ask that everyone pray that the truth comes out in 2020. And if you want to support this channel, there's a link in the description of this video and at the top right of my YouTube channel to do show your appreciation, give me a New Year's blessing, and blessings back to you.